It's hard to believe, but we have now come to the last panel of our conference, Media and the Fabric of Democracy. I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, Sophie Lecheler, who is a professor at the University of Vienna and an associate editor at the journal. So she completes the lineup of associate editors who have chaired various panels at this conference and who are really, a very, very important engine behind the workings of the journal. I could not do it without them, and I'm extremely grateful to them for their hard work. Thank you very much, Sophie, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Cristian. And I mean, nothing is truer than saying we wouldn't be here without you. That's for sure. Thank you for your hard work, and thank you for having me chair this session with this big title, so to say, that the presenters are now trying to address. I want to welcome you to this last session with the title Media and the Fabric of Democracy. And as my predecessors, I'm going to go through the three titles as they're listed in the program. And I want to ask the presenters to stick to their time of about 12, 15 minutes so that we have enough time to answer questions. I'm going to monitor the chair and the chat, and let's start. So our first paper today will be presented by, I think you're presenting it together. I see several of the presenters there. Porismita, Borah, Matthew Barnidge, and Hernando Rojas, with Democratization and Civic Communication, examining the, examining the communication mediation model on the various trajectories of democratization. Please take it away, Porismita and Matthew. I think I saw you.
Thank you. Hi, this is Porismita Borah, and I and Matt Barnidge, we are going to present this paper. This is my first IJPP. I'm really excited to be presenting. And I'm just going to give some introduction to the literature, and then Matt is going to present methods and results and so on and so forth. So just a little bit about the communication mediation model. First introduced in the Wisconsin school, it has been studied extensively, and it explains the mediated relationship between communication patterns between news use and political participation. And okay, all right. So yeah, and our study has two primary purposes. We replicate the communication mediation model in the context of 17 different countries. And we extend the previous model with the help of two moderated mediation models, examining the first stage from news to talk, and then versus the second stage from talk to participation. And so the positive association between informational media use and political participation has been consistently shown by different studies, and these findings have been shown to hold in newspaper use, online news use, social media use, and multiple media use. The idea is that news use can provide mobilizing information and resources to help citizens in political engagement, and so it is similarly, scholars have also shown a stable relationship between political discussion and political and civic participation. And the understanding is that during political discussion, individuals are able to understand their views or express their opinions, learn about politics from the other side, and perhaps they're able to come to a conclusion and in the process. The mediated relationship between individual predispositions and participation, often facilitated by the communication patterns, is at the heart of the communication mediation model. This core idea that talk mediates the impact of news on participation, it has been tested in many contexts. It has been updated by scholars in many different contexts and other different countries. And in one of the most recent adaptation, the model has been tested across cultures. And the authors find they replicate the main model, and they also show the moderating effects of democratic expression and press freedom. And what they find is that in countries with lower freedom of expression, discussion was negatively associated with political participation. And while countries with higher freedom of expression, political talk is positively related to participation. And then moreover, they also found that lower freedom of press was related to lower political participation. And with that help of that literature, we proposed the following hypothesis in our study. The first hypothesis, the political discussion is a mediator between news use and political participation. We replicate the communication mediation model. And then in the next two hypotheses, the indirect, we look at the indirect relationship between news use and political participation via political discussion. Via political discussion, that it'll be conditioned on democratization, which will moderate the relationship between news and discussion. And similarly, in the second, we look at the relationship between news use and political participation via political discussion, conditioned on democratization, which will moderate the part between discussion and participation. And with that, I will let Matt start with the methods.
Thank you, Pori, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you to Cristian and Sophie for organizing this panel. So I'm going to talk about the methods and results. So this study is based on data from the Comparative National Elections Project, which is a consortium of political communication scholars from around the world housed at The Ohio State University. To date, CNEP has collected about 60 surveys in, I think, more than 25 countries. So there was sort of a lot of data to choose from. So the first step was, which surveys, which specific country level surveys did we want to work with? And we had three selection criteria. First, the country had to be a democracy. So lately, CNEP has been studying countries like Russia, for example, or Iran, and according to, third-party observers such as Freedom House and VDEM Institute, these are not, technically speaking, democracies. So that was our first criterion. The country had to be a democracy. Second, it had to be the most recent survey for a given country. And third, of course, we needed available data on our key variables. So based on those three criteria, we were left with 17 surveys and an overall sample size of almost 30,000 cases. And you can see the list of surveys there. So I think a special note is warranted regarding two countries. Those would be Turkey and Hong Kong. So you'll notice Turkey, the survey was conducted in 2014. Which is the year Erdogan took power or took office. And the survey was conducted after Erdogan took office. So Erdogan took office, I think, in the spring or summer of 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And the survey was conducted late 2014, running into early 2015. And so there's a question of whether Turkey, qualified based on our criteria. And we decided that it did because I'm not an expert on Turkey itself, but we did a lot of reading on at what point was Turkey no longer considered a democracy by Freedom House and VDEM, and we read that point was sort of 2017 with a series of constitutional reforms ushered in by Erdogan. And so for the purposes of this study, we are considering Turkey to be a democracy in 2014, although you will see it has consistently sort of the lowest effect sizes and the lowest score on the democratization index. The second country is Hong Kong, and sort of same story here. We considered Hong Kong to be a democracy at the time the survey was conducted, even though democratic suppression has been going on in Hong Kong since 2017. It was widely considered a democracy in 2015 at the time the survey was conducted. Okay, so in addition to the 17 surveys, we collected external country level data from 2 sources. From Freedom House, we took their Political Freedom Index and Press Freedom Index for the year in which the survey was conducted. And from the VDIM Institute, we collected the Liberal Democracy Index and the Free Expression Index. We standardized these indices. They were all highly correlated, so we combined them into a single democratization index, and that is our moderator in our moderated mediation process. So here's a look at the democratization index, the country scores for each of the countries in the analysis. It sort of meets the eyeball test, if you will. We see high scores or scores above the mean in countries like the United States, France, Great Britain, and it is Great Britain, not the UK, because Northern Ireland, I believe, is not included in the survey. Germany, Spain, Portugal, and we see sort of lower than average scores in places like Kenya, Indonesia, Turkey, Colombia, and Mexico. Okay, so we had 4 dependent variables, each of which were binary measures: work for a campaign, attend a protest, attempted persuasion, and voting. Our mediator was political talk or discussion, which was measured with a 5-item scale. Our independent variable, news use, measured with a 3-item scale. And then finally, our control variables, we were pretty limited in terms of what we could control for, because we were working with the ML Med macro for SPSS, which is a level mediation macro. And currently that only allows you 3 covariates. So we were really forced to decide which were the 3 most important covariates, and we opted for age, gender, and political interest. We chose political interest instead of variables like education and income, or SES. Okay, so the first thing we did is we tested indirect effects individually or separately in each of the 17 countries, as well as sort of in the overall data set. And here you can see those effects. These are odds ratios. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to standardize logit coefficients and stuff like that, and then I realized it was super simple, just take the odds ratio. So these are odds ratios. It gives you a good sense of how the effect sizes compare to one another. In the last column, we have the democratization index and that country score on the democratization index. And so generally speaking, we expect larger effect sizes sort of toward the top of the table and smaller effect sizes toward the bottom of the table. And we'll see once we get to the next slide, we see conformity to this expectation at the high end and the low end of the democratization index. And so those countries in the red box are at the high end, and at the low end we have one country, which is Turkey. So at the high end we have countries like Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Spain, the United States, and at the low end there's Turkey. In the middle we have a lot of countries that sort of deviate from our expectations. Some have higher than expected effect sizes, some have lower than expected effect sizes, and indeed we think this is sort of probably the most interesting finding from our study, or the most interesting question arising from our results, which is what's going on with these countries in the middle. The democratization index is really good at predicting countries that are high on the index and low on the index, but not so much countries that are in the middle. And so that's a question I'm going to pose for everyone sort of at the end. But these figures are just sort of simple OLS regression models based on the 15 countries using the democratization index to predict the odds ratio or effect sizes. Okay, so in the next stage of the analysis, we move to a sort of more formal moderated mediation analysis, where we used the democratization index as a moderator for the indirect relationship between news use and political participation through political discussion. So as Pori mentioned, there was one study conducted by Hilde Zuniga et al. That sort of did a similar analysis, but that study didn't necessarily specify whether the moderation occurred at the first stage of the process or the second stage. So first stage moderation would be moderation of that relationship between news use and political talk. second stage would be moderation between political talk and political participation. That analysis also, could we just go back? Yeah, thanks, Pori. That analysis also didn't specify whether the moderated effects were within group or between group. And so the within group effects would be sort of most comparable to the table I showed you before, sort of at the individual level within countries. Between group, this is the association between the means of each country. So it's not super clear why that would be important theoretically, but it is important to control. And so what we find here is we find second stage within group moderated mediation effects for 2 of the 4 outcomes in the analysis, those being protest and persuade. And you can see those confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals in bold in this table. In the next table, we probe these analyses by looking at the effect sizes at 3 different levels of the moderator, 1 standard deviation below the mean of democratization, at the mean of democratization, and 1 standard deviation above the mean. And you can see in both cases, those effect sizes get bigger when the democratization index gets higher. And so what this suggests is that these communication mediation processes are stronger where democratic institutions are also stronger. And that's, you know, as I said, particularly true for countries that score high on the scale, less true for those that score sort of in the middle of the scale. Okay, so in conclusion, we find moderated mediation for 2 of the 4 outcomes, indicating the indirect effect is stronger where democratization is higher. And specifically, the democratization moderates that relationship between talk and participation rather than the first stage between Nucius and talk. But again, there's large deviation from our predictions in the middle of the democratization range. So this study makes several contributions. First, it replicates the findings of Hilde et al. I didn't include the accents and the tilde. He would be mad at me if I left those out. We also sort of moved to a higher level of specification in the modeling for within group. We tested both within group and between group, and also first stage and second stage modeling. And then finally, our study identifies this missing middle in the middle of the democratization scale. The study did suffer from some limitations in data availability. For example, CNEP has multiple surveys from countries like Spain and Italy. However, the data were not the same in those countries. So for example, in the older surveys, they didn't ask the same questions. And so we couldn't do this sort of overtime analysis. That was our original idea, is that we wanted to look at this over time as a country democratized, but ultimately the data just weren't available. As the title suggests, we really wanted to add this element of trajectory. So as a country democratizes, not just its current status, but its growth in democratization, does that really affect the strength of communication mediation processes? So we tried calculating different scores between a sort of arbitrary baseline in 2002 and the current democratization score, but variance on those different scores were quite limited, and the variable didn't predict anything, so that ultimately didn't work. There are also some technical issues with weighting that we need to work out. But overall, sort of despite these limitations, I think we're providing at least some evidence that communication mediation processes are stronger where democratic institutions are also stronger. But we have a lot of work to do. And in particular, I think we would be open to feedback in terms of moving forward in incorporating trajectory, that element of trajectory, a country's growth and democratization. And we're thinking at this point that we need to move to a qualitative analysis, historical contextualization, and really engage that sort of tension between, and this is something Cristian talked about at ICA, the tension between a universalist approach to comparative research and context-specific approaches. Right now, our analysis is pretty universalist, and we would like to incorporate that more context-specific elements, perhaps doing a deeper dive into particular examples. So that's all I have. I apologize for going over time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much. Porismita and Matt. Thank you for presenting this presentation. This paper. This is so in line with the things that we at IJPP discuss very often, the idea of comparative research. So let's see what kind of questions does the audience have. I think the first question I got in was a question about your data from Muhammad Saud, who asked, what kind of survey are you using from Indonesia? Maybe you could just clarify that for us.
That's a great question, and I have, so CNEP kind of maintains technical information for each of the countries, and I have this in the paper itself, which I have on my laptop here. So in Indonesia, the survey was collected by a company called Saiful Majani Research Consulting, CSR. It was a face-to-face survey that used stratified multi-stage random sampling, and it's a nationally representative sample of adults with an 86% response rate. That sounds high, but that's the information that I have.
Who knows, yeah. Thank you, Matt. I think that's otherwise maybe you could chat later with them and see a little bit what other questions they have about the specific countries. With a very big question, I think, but a very important one from Fred Mudai. How does this sit with or advance, contradict, or add to the media effects debate over the years? So please answer in 1 minute or less. I'm kidding. You have a couple of minutes.
So there's, we've all for the longest time had this debate over, strong effects and limited effects. And I think what we're seeing is that the strength of effects really depends on the context, and it depends on the institutional arrangement in a given country. And so I think that's an aspect of the media effects debate that we're just starting to engage. And I think it's one that we need to engage a little bit further. I don't think our study is the definitive statement on that conversation, but I hope we've contributed to it in a small way, in that we're saying we really need to take this into account. I think we need to move beyond the days when we did studies in the United States and said this applies to other countries across the board.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Matt. I mean, you can always engage in the chat afterwards as well with the people who ask questions. I'm going to also highlight another question here by Francisco. Some problem with the middle of the road countries that even if they're moving away from authoritarian regimes, they're not necessarily democratizing. Like Donald and Schmidt noted, liberalization does not necessarily result in democratization, and many countries have setbacks.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And I think, we tried to rely on third-party assessments of democratization, Freedom House and the VDIM Institute. I think both of those, are subject to certain biases, and what they're both sort of engaged in this project of trying to quantify democratization, which might be rather difficult, and I'm sure they're leaving things out. And so that's why we want to do that deeper dive into specific case studies, and we would love to, I think, delve into the middle of the scale there, countries in the middle of the democratization scale, to learn a little bit more about the historical context and the specific trajectories of those countries. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, we're actually sort of seeking outside collaborators or new collaborators who can sort of bring that perspective. So if this is something you're interested in, especially if you're a researcher who specializes in qualitative or historical perspectives, we would certainly be interested in hearing from you.
All right, great. So there's the call for collaborators. Great. But I just want to read out, we have a compliment, not a question, from Michelle Bullian. I think you're addressing a clear research gap. The democratization, that's a really difficult word for Germans, or de-democratization, thanks for making it harder, and the role of media on citizen participation. This is a great project. As for your three covariates, she's got some suggestions for you, and she's going to email you separately. So you can read her comment in the section, but she's going to send you an email. And Francisco also wants to say great work and add to that. Do we have any other questions? If not, then I'll release Matt and Puri. I hope she can maybe hear us again. Thank you again for a great presentation. Yeah, and you know, please, you know, watch the chat and see what other questions. Oh, hi, Kat. What other what other questions and comments come up for your work? Then we're going to go to the next presenters. Thanks, you two. And that's Sina Blassnig and Frank Esser. Are they here?
Yes. Hi.
Yes, hi, Sina. And Sina is going to present Understanding the Logic of the Public in Contemporary Political Affairs Coverage. Take it away.
Yes. So hi, and welcome to our presentation, also on behalf of Frank Esser, who is also in the call. So starting point for this study was that research into mediatization has often been accused of not taking enough account of the role of the audience. Concepts of news media logic have sometimes considered the role of the audience theoretically, mostly as an implicit force, if they did. However, the audience or the public has hardly ever played a central role in empirical studies of mediatization or media logics. Yet the audience and the public have arguably even become a more central force with the emergence of digital news media. So in this paper, we investigate whether and how the logic of news has changed in the transition from print to digital news media since the early 2000s, and whether a new and more public-oriented logic has emerged. Thereby we focus on commercial logic on the one hand and a public logic on the other, and we draw cross-temporal, cross-national, and cross-organizational comparisons. As probably most of you know, mediatization at its core assumes that the production and the content of political news is increasingly guided by a news media logic rather than, for example, a political logic. And news media logic following Esser 2013 can be defined as a concept combining at least three components. First, professionalization, second, commercialization, and third, technological change. However, how these three dimensions of news logic affect the content of news, and also which of these three forces are more dominant, depends on contextual conditions. So, for example, this depends on the professional, the commercial, or the technological orientation of different news media organizations, and also on aspects of different political and media systems, such as the media market or the affinity for technology in different countries. So news media logic should not only be investigated over time, but also compared cross-nationally and cross-organizationally. However, as I mentioned before, research on mediatization and media logic so far has mostly neglected another important influence factor, which is the role of the public. In contrast, much of research on mediatization in the last few decades has focused on commercialization and commercial media logic. Landre describes this as a market orientation of news media. So he would argue that the news media have become more audience oriented, also more populist, more demand driven, and increasingly follow the imperative of newsworthiness. So commercial logic is geared to produce news content that is attractive to the audience and that also engages the audience. And the main goal is to maximize the distribution of journalistic products, so articles, but of course also the ads that go with the articles. And this increasing identification with the audience could be seen as an indicator for a generally increasing audience orientation of news media. So some authors have also argued that commercial logic has been the result of a shift from a more supply market to rather a demand-oriented market. However, following a commercial logic, journalists do not address the audience as individual citizens, but rather as consumers. So the role of the audience still remains rather passive and limited in the concept of commercial media logic. In an attempt to address this shortcoming, Brands and Van Praag have suggested that a new logic of the public has developed. And following this logic, news media are increasingly oriented towards the preferences of individual citizens and try to anticipate the audience's wishes and needs. And here we think that the technological development of digital media may be a specific driver of such a logic that centers the interests and needs of citizens. Because these digital media allow, on the one hand, for stronger user involvement, and on the other hand, also for a stronger simplification that may make it easier for citizens to follow the news. And in this study, we assumed that a public logic could develop from a commercial logic and exist alongside the more traditional commercial logic. And furthermore, we expect that similarly to commercial logic, the manifestation of a public logic depends also on contextual conditions of different national media markets and different types of news organizations. And this leads us to our hypotheses. First, regarding the cross-temporal development, we focus on commercial logic. And here, previous results by Umbricht and Esser suggest that after a longer phase of increasing commercialization, this orientation towards a commercial logic has rather leveled off. So these findings lead us to expect that commercial logic has remained meaningful, but that there has been no increase in commercially motivated content features since the early 2000s. Rather, we expect that this orientation toward commercial media logic has remained largely stable, especially in traditional news media organizations. Second, we look at cross-national differences. And in this respect, we compare two extreme cases. On the one hand, a large-scale free market liberal media market in the form of the US, and on the other hand, a small-sized, more regulated corporatist media market in the form of Switzerland. And in line with previous research, we expect that the orientation toward commercial media logic is higher in the US rather than in Switzerland. And however, with regard to public logic, in contrast, it could be that a lower degree of commercialization and a higher public service orientation may be more favorable actually for public media logic. However, since there has not been any theoretical work or empirical analyses in this regard, we have formulated this as an open research question. And finally, we also conduct cross-organizational comparisons. And here we focus on traditional nationwide newspapers, so quality and tabloid news outlets on the one hand, versus digital native news organizations on the other hand. And we expect that the orientation towards a more traditional commercial media logic is higher in traditional nationwide newspapers, whereas we expect digital native news outlets rather to follow a public media logic. To answer these hypotheses, we rely on data from a quantitative content analysis of political news coverage in the outlets that were just listed before in Switzerland and the US. For the cross-temporal comparison in hypothesis 1, we focus on two quality newspapers, the New York Times and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and compare two time periods. And here, the first sampling period spans from 2006 to 2007, and this is based on a previous data collection by Umbricht and Esser. For the remaining hypotheses, we focus on the second time period from January 1st to June 1st in 2019, but here we look at the full range of media organizations. In both time periods, we focused on political news coverage. However, we followed different sampling approaches for both time periods because we believe this accounts for changes in how newspapers push their most important news stories. So in 2006 and 2007, we focused on the front pages of traditional print outlets, whereas in 2019, we took the Facebook pages of news outlets as the starting point and sampled the online articles that were published on these Facebook pages. Here you see the operationalization for both commercial logic and public logic. We coded commercial logic based on, I would say, the usual suspects such as sensationalism, negativity, emotionalism, and emotionalization, and so on. With regard to public logic, we focused on more technological elements that in our view help to fulfill the citizens' needs or wishes for, on the one hand, a stronger audience involvement, and on the other hand, a stronger simplification. And each indicator was either coded as a dummy variable or later transformed into a dummy variable And for both logics, we calculated mean indices that, so these indices range from 0 to 1 and refer to the average occurrence of the individual characteristics of the respective logic. So what did we find? And here, just a quick note that all the results that I will present are based on analyses of variance. So first, with regard to the cross-temporal comparison of commercial logic, we find that there is no significant difference between the two time periods under investigation. And in fact, we find that the presence of content characteristics that indicate such a commercial logic is almost identical in both time periods. And there was also no time effect visible if we looked at the two news outlets separately. So the first hypothesis is supported, as we find no significant increase, but also no decrease in the orientation towards commercial media logic in this transition from print to online news outlets. With regard to the cross-national comparison, as expected, online news media in the US are more oriented towards a commercial logic than online news media in Switzerland. So here also this supported our hypothesis and is mainly in line with previous research. With regard to public logic, we find that actually Swiss online media are slightly more oriented towards a public logic than American online media. So here, a lower degree of commercialization and higher public service orientation may actually favor such a public logic. However, we believe that this needs further investigation and also to look at more country cases. And finally, with regard to the cross-organizational comparison, with regard to commercial media logic, our findings support our assumption that the orientation towards commercial media logic is higher in traditional nationwide newspapers than in these newly founded digital native news organizations. And interestingly, it was particularly the quality news media in both countries that follow such a commercial media logic. And finally, with regard to public logic, we found that digital native news outlets are more oriented towards a public logic than traditional tabloid and quality media. And again, this is in line with what we expected. So it seems to be especially these outlets that push such a newer public logic. And here we also saw that the media type seems to be more important with regard to public logic than the country differences. So what are the main conclusions and also some limitations? So first, we find that commercial logic remains a constant force on political news coverage. And this especially for traditional and quality newspapers. However, commercialization has stopped increasing in the past few decades. Second, more recently, a more audience-oriented public logic has seemed to develop in political reporting and specifically in digital native news outlets. And finally, the manifestation of news media logics varies across different contextual settings and also across different media types, which emphasizes the need for comparative research. However, of course, our study has certain limitations. First, with regard to the country and the media organizations, we looked only at a limited sample. Secondly, the comparability of the two periods of time is rather limited because we have two data collections we also follow different sampling strategies. And finally, also our conceptualization of public logic can still be further developed as we focus mainly on technological aspects, and also the role of the audience is still rather passive. So this is still work in progress, and we are looking very much forward to your questions and comments. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and yes, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sina, and thank you, Frank. I know that you're also on the call. Thank you for your presentation. Let's see what kind of questions come in. We have a first, compliment already, comprehensive PowerPoint presentation and brief information, good research. So that's great. The compliments are always welcome. Do you have any questions for Sina and for Frank? While we're waiting for questions to come in, maybe I can start with a question. I want to come to this very last point you made, conceptualizations of public logic, because I think that's might be a limiting part indeed. I mean, yeah, comparative research can always be bigger and more data, but because when I first heard about your personalization, I think this sounded a little bit like, you know, this kind of early interactivity research about, you know, is there a click button? Can you click? Can you comment? And then this is a public logic. But how, in what direction do you think this kind of a new conceptualization of public logic should go? What kind of theoretical work do we need to do to better understand the role of the public in the digital media?
As I said, I think this really is a limitation that we are still rather focusing on these interactive parts. We are currently doing an additional study where we try to connect this also with content characteristics, and perhaps also see not only divide this from the start into these different logics, but rather how perhaps these interactive features may mix with other content characteristics, such as addressing the public or focusing on views of the public or individual representative of the public. So I would say this would be one of the direction, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. While I was saying the question, Paul DeAngelo also writes, what are some of the ways to make the conceptualization of the public logic richer than it is? So I think this is something that might be like a central point. And perhaps also in terms of not making a mere lip service, because everything has a comment section and that says literally nothing about the level of political discussion it inspires. So I think that might be a really important point. Elena Block says, thanks Sina and Frank, greetings. Have you researched a populist logic in the media?
I mean, as Elena I think knows, of course Frank and I have both done several research with regard to populism. We have investigated how the media and journalists have covered populist actors, and also how they apply populist content features themselves. So how journalists have used populist strategies or populist key messages in the media, which actually we find that this is rather limited. They rather rarely use populist key messages themselves, but they are very happy or ready to cover populist statements by other actors, but not in this particular study. We have not looked at this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sina. Diego is saying, Sina, are you conducting the same research looking at political parallelism in traditional versus digital native news outlets? So are you comparing traditional versus digital native news outlets as well?
I mean, we are comparing traditional versus digital native news outlets, but we didn't investigate political parallelism. I'm not sure if Diego means with regard to the content or the context, but I guess both could be interesting aspects. So to compare countries that differ with regard to political parallelism, how their content differs, but also, I guess, aspects of political parallelism in the content. But no, we didn't look at this.
Lots of inspiration for your next content analysis.
Yes.
Any other questions from the audience for Sina and Frank? Anna Schulz is saying, thanks, Sina, good to see you. I'm translating this now for her. Are you looking to expand this research into other countries?
Good to see you, or well, read you too, of course. We are currently conducting an analysis that is based on similar categories that also includes the UK and Germany. So to 4 countries, of course. It would be better to have more countries, but here we are a bit limited with regard to our coders, especially language-wise. It is often or always difficult. But yeah, so this we are at least to 4 countries.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, she says, great, thanks. I guess you guys can chat as well. Again, I want to highlight for you both, Sina and Frank, that look at the chats now that you're finished with your presentation and see what other comments and questions come up, and also collect your compliments. Then I would like to move to the third presentation. Thank you again, Sina.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie.
Third presentation by Ariel, Hasell, and Brian Weeks, who I haven't seen yet, or maybe their cameras are not yet on. Maybe
I'm here.
Oh yeah, you're here. Hi, Ariel.
Hello.
Yeah, I keep on switching between different kind of views here in Zoom. Well, welcome. Thank you for presenting. This is the very last presentation, so
No pressure.
You know, no pressure at all. So you're presenting your paper, How Social Media Use Promotes Political Cynicism, and I'll just say, share your screen and get us started. Welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone see it okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity to present here and such a great conference. I'm presenting a study I co-authored with my colleague Brian Weeks, and it's on how social media use promotes political cynicism. So to begin, I wanted to start by defining cynicism, and political cynicism is an attitude rooted in distrust of the motivations of political actors and beliefs that political actors are corrupt, self-serving, and generally disinterested in serving the public good. It's strongly related to distrust, but it's a distinct concept. It refers specifically to the motivations and integrity of those participating in the political process, whereas trust often refers to the perceptions of relational benevolence and competencies also, in addition to motivation. So cynical people see the political process as one motivated by calculated self-serving strategies aimed at winning rather than governing. Given the very real corruption and breaches of public trust sometimes committed by those in power, it can be reasonable for the public to be skeptical of politics, but that's not the same thing as dismissing the democratic process in its entirety as a system that is flawed, failing, and inherently corrupt. So political cynicism can then be seen as a rejection of the idea that democratic processes, policies, and politicians can be motivated to do what is right for citizens. So this matters because political cynicism seems to be on the rise in both the US and Europe, and this is concerning to many because of the negative effects it can have on democratic outcomes. Research demonstrates that cynicism can influence the way people make sense of political information and encourage demobilization. It has also been found to be associated with distrust, apathy, and withdrawal from political processes, especially among those who are least politically sophisticated and those who are less partisan. It can also decrease support for policies and bias voters against incumbent candidates. So overall, these outcomes tend to delegitimize democratic processes and reinforce negative attitudes towards politics. Over the last few decades, scholars have been particularly concerned with how content and coverage produced by news media may contribute to political cynicism among the public. In particular, scholars have noted that strategy frames or strategic news coverage can lead to increased cynicism in news audiences, as does news coverage that's characterized by conflict and incivility, negativity, and political infotainment like satire and late night talk shows. So while a few people have begun to explore the role of social media use on political trust, there's less research on how social media use might contribute to political cynicism. Now, the majority of content that people share on social media has very little to do with news and politics, but the content that is related to news and politics is very much characterized by these strategy frames, conflict, incivility, and negativity, all of which can contribute to political cynicism. So our first hypothesis in the study posits that political use of social media will be associated with increased political cynicism. However, not everybody explicitly uses social media for politics. In fact, a majority of people don't. Instead, they typically use it to connect with friends and family and for entertainment and other types of purposes. So this raises the question of whether using social media for these social purposes can also lead to political cynicism. On the one hand, even people who use social media for purely political purposes are still incidentally exposed to a significant amount of news and political information while using social media. So it's possible that they still encounter that same strategic news coverage, that negativity, that incivility, etc., that we know tend to encourage political cynicism. On the other hand, just because people are incidentally exposed to news in their daily social media doesn't necessarily mean that they read it carefully, they elaborate on it, or they otherwise engage with it. So research demonstrates that incidental exposure to news does not necessarily increase political knowledge and attention unless people are already inclined to be interested in politics. So because of this, we ask our first research question whether or not using social media for social purposes influences political cynicism. And if there is a relationship between social use of social media and political cynicism, we suspect that it is likely a result of this incidental exposure to news and social media. So we ask whether the relationship between using social media for social purposes and political cynicism is mediated by this incidental exposure to news and social media. So to examine this, we used a YouGov two-wave survey in the fall of 2016. The full method, measures, and descriptives are all available in the downloaded paper. But broadly, this survey data was collected in the fall of 2016 through a two-wave national online survey in the United States. And the sample is not representative, but it is matched to reflect the population of the US on demographics like gender, race, age, education, and income. And so for all analyses, the main independent variables measured frequency of political use of Facebook in the last 30 days and frequency of social use of social media in the last 30 days. The main dependent variable is political cynicism, and that's measured in the second wave of the survey. We also measured it in the first wave of the survey, and all of our analyses also control for the wave one measure of political cynicism. We also measured incidental exposure to news on social media for our mediating variable, and all the analyses also account for or control for interest in politics, political affiliation, political knowledge, offline news use, online news use, in addition to age, gender, race, and education. So the first hypothesis and research question examined the influence of political use of Facebook and social uses of social media on political cynicism. So to test these, we ran an OLS regression analysis with the two-wave political cynicism as the dependent variable. We found that political use of Facebook was associated with increased political cynicism. And so because the model controls for prior levels of cynicism, the results suggest that the more that individuals used Facebook for political purposes during the election season, the more cynical they became about politics in 2016. So we also found that social use of social media is significantly associated with decreased levels of political cynicism, even when controlling for previous levels of cynicism. So this indicates that all other things being equal, the more individuals use social media to connect with friends and family during the course of the election, the less cynical they became about politics. So for our second research question, we also wanted to examine whether incidental exposure to news and politics might mediate the relationship between social use of social media and political cynicism. We ran a mediation analysis using the process macro and SPSS to test the direct and indirect effect of social use on social media on political cynicism via incidental exposure to news and social media. And the results show that people who use social media to connect with friends and family were likely to stumble upon news while using social media, but that this incidental exposure had no significant impact on political cynicism. And also the overall indirect effect was not significant. So the results have a number of implications for those interested in how social media use might be affecting political attitudes and outcomes, but I just want to highlight three important points here. First is that using social media to seek and share and discuss information about politics can increase political cynicism. And this suggests that using social media, or this suggests that through social media, that people can access, search, and discuss political information, but the quality of that information and the quality of that discussion may actually have negative democratic consequences. Our data don't actually account for what kind of political content people are exposed to in social media, though research and theory suggests that the increased cynicism is likely due to this presence of negativity, incivility, and strategic coverage of politics. And that brings me to my second point, which is that increased cynicism is traditionally thought of as a major concern for scholars because of the effects that cynicism can have on making sense of political information, including increasing political apathy and demobilizing participation. So in other words, it's thought to be really bad for democracy. And at the same time, there's some more recent evidence to suggest that cynicism doesn't necessarily depress voter turnout, especially among those who are politically interested and engaged anyway, and that it might actually encourage some people to be more supportive of other forms of participation. So a lot of this recent work is coming from Europe, and it may be that some of the effects of cynicism may vary depending on the cultural relationships that, that citizens have to their government. So in short, more research is needed to understand not only how social media use produces political cynicism, but also to understand exactly what are the effects of political cynicism in a social media environment, both in Western democracies and other parts of the world. And then finally, our results show that people using social media for entertainment purposes and for connecting with friends do not experience the same increase in political cynicism, despite their being incidentally exposed to political information when they use social media. So not everyone uses social media for political purposes, and the study highlights how political outcomes might be dependent on whether one actively seeks political information. And this is consistent with other research that finds those who are incidentally exposed to political information don't experience some of the same effects as those who seek political information in social media. The relationship between social use of social media and political cynicism provides support for the idea that these individuals do not attend to or elaborate much on the political information they stumble across while they're using social media. And in turn, they might experience different consequences than more active audiences, and whether those consequences are positive or negative. So I'm trying to keep it brief here, so I'm going to end it there today and just again say thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Thank you for your presentation and on this super important topic, and a topic that interests a lot of people. So you already have all your questions coming in. I'm just going to start going through them. So the first question we have from Muhammad is, if social media is developing political cynicism, then shouldn't we stop using it? And then he also has a follow-up question. And could you, if I want to compile the data for similar research, could you guide me a little bit on how to collect the data? I mean, I guess give a short question answer to that now, and then perhaps you guys can interact online as well to give a little bit, a couple more tips. But so, you know, shouldn't we limit our use of social media if the negative effects are there? And what would you do to guide other researchers in collecting similar data? What would you suggest?
Well, it sounds from our data, and it sounds like that if you are just using social media for these really social purposes to connect with other people, that maybe you aren't actually experiencing these effects. And so that's perfectly okay. My personal opinion about social media and politics might be that social media isn't doing very much for politics, at least in America. I say that though as a very biased person who quit Facebook in 2006. So I'm here now, 14 years Facebook free, and very hopeful about politics. But that's a very biased opinion. As far as how to collect this data, we used, cynicism sort of fell out of favor in terms of research in the US, but there's a lot of people in Europe doing really, really amazing work on social media, on just cynicism towards politics. And there's so many different measures that people are using. And I to be honest, I'm not sure that our measure is the end all and be all. And so I would suggest looking at what some of the recent work that's coming out of Europe and how they're measuring cynicism. I think that would be probably my first step.
Thank you, Ariel. Maybe you can, afterwards go into the chat again, you or Brian, and interact with the questions and give a couple more tips for where to look and what kind of papers you're referring to specifically.
Sure.
I have another question from Cristian. Thank you, Ariel. How do we draw the line, especially when using surveys between cynicism and skepticism? Could it be that your survey picked up skepticism as much or even more than cynicism?
That's entirely possible. I think that the skepticism measures that people use are quite different from the cynicism measures, because it's one thing to be slightly mistrustful of politicians, and most of the research says that certain amount of skepticism is very healthy for democracy. But our cynicism measure, I can pull it up, basically refers to the fact that there's very little you can do as a citizen to get corruption out of politics. This means that corruption is one of them. Corruption is always present in American politics. It doesn't matter which party you vote for. No matter which party in power, it seems like our government is really only run by a few big interest groups. And so things like that. And so that, for me, conceptually is different from skepticism, which is skepticism might be, well, some politicians are influenced by big interest groups, but cynicism is sort of the dismissiveness of that political process, saying that, you know what, none of this matters. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter who's in power, because they're all so corrupt and wrong, which is a fairly detrimental view to have of democracy, I think.
Yes, and going even further here, Fred is asking, so how is social media enhanced political cynicism linked to voting behavior in the US case?
That's a great question. I have a survey going out today that I'm looking at that, but I didn't actually have that data in this survey that I had. So what the recent work comes out is showing that actually people who are very cynical about politics tend to be highly interested and highly partisan. And so they're going to vote no matter what anyway. And so the danger becomes of all of these people who are perhaps less interested in politics, more centrist, don't have really strong opinions. When those people become cynical, historically, they tend to not vote very much. It's sort of there, if your vote doesn't matter, if you genuinely believe that your vote has nothing, that no matter which party in power, your interests aren't going to be served, those people tend to just opt out of the voting process and not show up to the ballot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's an important one. We have loads more questions coming in for you. So is political cynicism only defined, Alex asks, is political cynicism only defined as an unreasoned negative attitudes toward political actors, for example, due to disinformation or tabloid smearing, or does it also cover situations in which fear or political corruption is and it is a reflection of reality? And they also say, fantastically important topic, thanks for your presentation. So can political cynicism also just be appropriate?
Well, I think sometimes, yes. I think looking at the political situation in many countries right now, believing that would be true is, I think that sometimes cynicism feels very appropriate. On the other hand, I think that what is dangerous about cynicism is that it dismisses democracy as an unworkable solution. And I think that you can be critical of how governments are run without actually believing that democracy is unworkable. So the true cynicism, I think cynics don't think anything can change, whereas people who are just angry and upset and deeply disturbed by what might be going on in any particular government, I would imagine those people, what separates them from the cynicism is the hope. This idea that, yes, it can change if we enact certain laws, if we change the government, put different people in power, then different outcomes are possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matt asks, thank you, Ariel. Very interesting presentation. Can you elaborate about the theoretical connection between incidental exposure and political cynicism?
Yeah, and so what we were trying to do there is, there's a small body of research that's showing that intent with social media use is really important, whether or not people are actively seeking political information or whether or not they're just stumbling upon it. And so we were thinking that because you see so much insider talk on social media about strategy, about horse race coverage, all of these things that we know that when they appear in news media, they create a lot of cynicism in news audiences. And so we think that because all of that happens in social media, that would also create cynicism. And then there's this idea that, well, all of these people who don't really pay attention to news and politics, they're not the ones staying up late watching cable news and getting all of that strategy coverage that Jameson and Capella wrote about in their book in the 90s. But that if you're just using social media for just, to look at pictures of your friends' kids and all of these sort of very normal reasons for using social media, you might still actually see these strategy frames. And so our thinking was that if it is definitely these strategy frames, that even stumbling upon them accidentally could potentially lead to people to be more cynical. And we didn't actually find that. And so our sort of interpreting that data from the finding is that those people who really aren't using it for political purposes, they're not elaborating on that information. They might see it, but they don't really know how to interpret it. They're not attending to it very much. And so even though they're seeing it, because they're not really cognitively engaging with it, that it's not having that same effect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Actually, I've got a couple of people asking about platform differences. So I think Diego and also Elena asking, so how would this look on different platforms? Are there platform differences for these kind of findings?
I would love to look at that. I don't have that in our data. Our political use variable was only with Facebook. So really the political findings we can only definitively say about Facebook. And the social use of social media was a more broad question. So that was like sort of a-platformic. There's just no platform that was specifically referring to. But I would imagine that there would be some sort of platform differences in the way people engage, especially because certain platforms are far more text-based than others. Others are far more visually based. And so I would imagine, without having done that, that you might see some important differences just with the way that people choose to engage with them, and also the different sort of relationships that people have with others on platforms. You know, in Twitter, it's much more common, and Twitter and Instagram, it's much more common to follow lots of people that you actually don't know in person, whereas Facebook, that tends to be less common in the research. There tends to be reciprocal relationships. So that may have an impact too on whether or not cynicism is an outcome of political use of social media on those different platforms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ariel. I think at close it, there is a couple more questions for you there, also about elections that we already talked about other things. Ariel, please have a look at the chat section and interact with the people there.
I will.
Yes, there's loads of questions and also compliments for you to collect. And I want to thank you again for your presentation. I want to thank all presenters for being making this a great last panel. And I want to now hand the gavel back to Cristian. Cristian?
Yes, thank you.
Over? Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you to all the presenters. I think we've definitely ended on a very high note. I'm just going to say a few words, and then we have some time for informal networking. So if people feel comfortable, please feel free to switch on your video feed so that, we can see each other, and that's going to be a bit more informal. I don't have, a whole lot to say. I think it's been, the best 20 hours on Zoom in 4 days in my entire life, and I'm very grateful to all of you for participating. I think this conference has shown not only how large our community is. We've had more than 600 people that have presented or participated in the conference from 75 countries. That's really impressive, and to be honest, it blew my mind. I didn't think it was gonna be this way. I used to think we had quality. I mean, I was really impressed with all of the presentations, and I think we had. I don't want to use the word diversity. I want to use the word breadth. We had a lot of different parts of the world that were illuminated by your work. We had lots of different methodologies, different approaches to how we go about studying the issues we care about. And that has been, quite stimulating and enlightening. And I think this is what the journal aims to be, a place where we can have these conversations, where research that is innovative and relevant can be published, a place where research that is, that travels beyond boundaries and that is less bounded by the kinds of structural inequalities and hierarchies that we talked about at the beginning of today's session, can find a house and can find an audience and can spread, as far as we can. To this end, let me remind you, we have an edited collection with 29 great articles that the journal has published in the last few years that aim to tackle some of these issues. That is available for free to download to everybody until the end of October. We also have a special issue on digital threats to democracy that Mike Miller and I put together with some support from the Social Science Research Council, with contributions, again, from all around the world, that is still available for free to download until the end of September. So, if you haven't had enough of all these interesting interactions and insights, please go download these papers. Also, we will be publishing the videos of the proceedings as soon as my computer can digest the files that I will be downloading from Zoom, and also as soon as I can modestly edit them with my, very limited skills. I'll be in touch with the presenters before publishing the videos, just to make sure that they're okay with the video being published on YouTube. But please be on the lookout for some additional content if you have missed some sessions, and please feel free to use these as in whichever way you want. As Eric Busey suggested that he's been using them to to teach PhD students, for example. Whatever you think will be helpful, please feel free to do that with these videos. There's going to be a special issue coming out of this conference. The special issue from last year's conference is being finalized very soon. Not all the authors are here, of course, but just for the sake of clarity, in the next few days, I will consult with panel chairs, combine their assessments with my own ideas and assessments, and then I will informally invite the authors of a few papers, probably between 10 and 20 to submit to the special issue. All these papers will undergo peer review in the exact same way as every other paper. So if you don't get an invitation, but you still would like your paper to be considered, by all means submit it. The conference special issue, like every other special issue, doesn't provide any preferential treatment. It's just that there are these papers that we really liked and we would really like for them to be considered. But of course, everything will go through peer review. And as I said, last year, we tried to give everyone, a fair shake, a swift decision, but also a decision based on, good comments, constructive comments. And sometimes those decisions are not accept or revise. Sometimes these decisions are reject, but hopefully those comments are still helpful. And, that will happen for some of the papers we are going to invite to submit. And generally, whether you presented here or not, please do consider submitting to the journal. As I said in the roundtable, editors can only publish what they receive. And the more diverse, the more inclusive, the broader research we receive, the broader the research that we can publish is going to be. And so please do consider submitting for the journal, as well as other journals, of course. We have a vibrant, burgeoning field with lots of journals that are doing great, and we hope to be one of them. I just want to say thank you to a few people. I want to thank the presenters, but also those who submitted and didn't make it. Thanks for making this my job in selecting these papers very difficult, and thanks for making the quality of the conference very high. I want to thank the participants to the roundtable earlier today, which was really enlightening, and I'm going to try to publish that video as soon as possible so that we can continue the important conversation that we started today. I want to thank the panel chairs for helping run the conference smoothly, and frankly for taking some of the weight off my shoulders, because I was managing things on the back end, and it was absolutely the first time that I was running a virtual conference. I'm glad nothing disastrous happened, but that was largely thanks to the fact that chairs were there to keep the conversation going during the panels. I want to thank everyone who participated. Again, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that so many people were interested in the conference from so many places in the world. I have perhaps posted too many heat maps on Twitter about where people were located that were participating in the conference, but I'm going to be honest, this completely blew my mind. It's been the most incredible professional experience that I've had to put together an event and have so many people from so many walks of life and so many places participate. And I think it might be stereotypical, but it is one of the few positive things about this crazy world that we're living in, that we can do these things in this way. I want to thank those who supported us with a voluntary contribution. One of my older former bosses used to say that social scientists don't practice what they teach. And so I've always tried to practice what I teach. And, one of the things we study is how, some media outlets are prospering through alternative forms of support like micropayments. And so I thought, well, maybe we can try through alternative forms of support like micropayments. And so I thought, well, maybe we can try something like that. I didn't call them micropayment. I called them voluntary contributions. And, we've raised almost £1,000 from 82 supporters. Some of you are here. And, I'm just grateful for that. Thanks to that, the conference has been free for everyone. and we will be able to offer some fee waivers to participants to next year's conference, which will be in September of 2021. The dates are not set yet. I hope it can be here, whether as a fully face-to-face event or as a hybrid event. If Life decides that it cannot be here, it will be online again, or it can be wherever Life takes us. But this is a yearly meeting that is very dear to me, and which is why the final person I want to thank, although I don't think he's here, is Rasmus Nielsen for inventing this conference and bequeathing it to me as one of the most important aspects of the journal's identity. I have to say this was one of the many things I didn't know I was going to be able to do properly when I took on the job as editor, but it's been turned out to be at least one of the things that are more exciting and fun for me to do. So I am very grateful for that.